Welcome, everyone. I'm Ilham Babkir, the moderator for today's session, which will be discussing the repercussions of the Gaza war on Yemen and the region. We will start the session in 5 minutes. I would like to welcome our 5 speakers, and I think you all know them. We have Majid Al-Madhaji, the chairperson of the Sana Center for Strategic Studies, and a co-founder and one of the most important researchers on Yemen. We have Yazid Saeed, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where he leads the civil military relations in Arab states and the impact of conflicts on states and societies. We also have Thomas Junot, a non-fellow resident of the Sana Center and associate professor at the Graduate School of Public International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. We also have Maysa Shuja'ad-Din, a senior researcher whose research focuses on ideological groups in Yemen. And we have Abdullah Ba'boud, a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center. His research focuses on foreign policy and relations and external security. In the chat, you will find, or I'll put in the chat, links to the introductions for the speakers in both English and Arabic. I would also like to inform the participants that the moderation will be in Arabic. And so if anyone needs interpretation, please make sure it is turned on. This session is going to be an hour and a half, 50 minutes for discussion of preliminary discussion, where we'll discuss 5 main topics: the growing threat of the Houthis on the region as a part of the Iranian axis of resistance, the route of the escalation, the Iranian role and alliances in the region, the Yemeni files, and the impact of the war on the negotiations track between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, and finally, the impact of the war on the internal security of Gulf states and their ability to support de-escalation. Afterwards, we will take questions and comments from the participants. I would also like to inform that this session is going to be broadcast live on the Sana Center's accounts and pages on YouTube, X, and Facebook. Welcome once again. Tufan al-Aqsa, or the Al-Aqsa Typhoon operation that was implemented by Hamas on the 7th of October, shined a light on the challenges caused by piecemeal solutions to core conflicts. Despite the fact that the American approach toward the region in the past 2 years has gone through very important transformations under President Biden's administration's attempt to engage more directly with countries, especially those normalizing with Israel, and increasing American military presence in an attempt to confront Iranian influence. The American administration has also continued to provide its support, military and security support for Israel outside of the political process, especially with the changes ongoing in the region and with the growth of Iran's allies in Syria and Iraq, Lebanon, and reaching Yemen. With the increasing repercussions of the war in Gaza and the increasing tensions militarily and politically in the region, with Israel and Washington on one end, the region is undergoing an important test in an attempt to ensure that this escalation does not continue with the increased risk of an expanded conflict. Unlike we see the formal statements of Iran, of the regime in Tehran, Iran manages this conflict through its allies and proxies in the region and through the members of the axis of resistance in an attempt to open several fronts in the region. And this will not threaten just Israel, but American and European interests and the interests of the Gulf states, specifically Saudi Arabia. This will impact several important and sensitive files, the most prominent of which is the Yemeni file, which we will focus on today, and how it is impacted by these interactions. This was not just the ideological basis, but has also allowed it to have a larger impact. We've seen the escalations by the Houthis, which might change the calculations of the West and the United States towards the importance of resolving the Yemen issue. If we'll start with the first part, Majid, with the front in Yemen and the statements and actions of the Houthis. In a televised interview, a prominent military advisor close to the IGRC said that Iran's response to what's happening in Gaza will come from Yemen. I think this shows clearly that they are trying to further focus on the group's role in the axis of resistance under Tehran's guidance. Yesterday, the group's military spokesperson said that they adopted or claimed responsibility for 3 attacks targeting Israel. Why is this escalation happening from Yemen and not from Iraq or Lebanon or Syria? Thank you very much, Ilham. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I think this is the reason for choosing Yemen was linked to the difference in costs. The response from Yemen first sends messages that the members of the Axis are involved in this escalation if needed, especially with the response coming from it. And secondly, this threat is not a costly one if there are retaliatory measures. The Israeli ability or the United States ability to target the Houthis might not be as feasible, and also the targeting by the Houthis of Israel is also a political message or an attempt to increase escalation by the axis of resistance rather than them getting fully involved. This axis getting fully involved in the conflict. So I think what we are witnessing is an introduction to the various actors in the axis getting involved. But like you said, this is the first time that the Houthis have gotten involved in their commitments to the axis outside of the scope of the Yemeni conflict. And the Houthis' involvement in the region was not really outside the territory of Saudi Arabia or the UAE before, but this will increase the presence of the Houthis in regional engagement or interactions, and I think shows what role they might play. Has Iran been able to convey a clear message to the Gulf states about the inability of the US to provide the necessary security guarantees? I think Iran has done this before, not now. There were strikes that targeted Aramco in the past, and they showed very clearly that the security guarantees that could be provided outside of the regional agreements with Tehran might not be as feasible. And Saudi Arabia responded with the dialogue track that they had in Beijing. The commitments made by the United States did not seem to be sufficient, but now this is a completely different level. The Houthis are now taking a risk. And this might lead to the international community rethinking the nature of the threat that they pose. First, they're not just threatening the regional interests, but they're opening a front to one of the most important allies of the West in the region, Israel. And so this is an unprecedented level or unprecedented audacity in the international engagement of the Houthis. The question is to what extent the Houthis will go. We know that these missile attacks are more political messages without having real strategic military value. The Houthis can become more militarily impactful if they target, for example, American assets in the region, including oil and gas facilities, or threatening international maritime routes in the Bab el-Mandeb. In this way, the Houthis will play a more effective role rather than just trying to convey political messages. And this will need rethinking by the Gulf and by the international community. In light of these threats, and now the Houthis may be becoming more and more important in geopolitical calculus regionally and internationally with the development of the military arsenal, could this become the most dangerous front in the axis of resistance with their threat that they pose to the Red Sea and also the proximity to important oil regions? First, the Houthis, I think, will definitely change the calculus in the region. The Houthis getting involved is a relatively new. Usually, the regional conflict between Israel and Palestine in the regions, or at least the surrounding areas, have been it has been limited to that. But now we're seeing actors outside of these border areas participating, and so this is new. Secondly, the threat is not just a threat to the direct security of Israel, but also to international interests that have international actors who have provided support for Israel, and this has angered the axis of resistance. And so we're seeing a completely new perspective of the threat that Houthis could pose, and I think we will see a differing effect or changing effect. And with the increasing Houthi threat in the region, could the Yemeni file go from being a secondary file to one that is important to be resolved, whether through a decisive military action or through a settlement? I think the question is, will this Houthi actions lead to the Yemeni file being resolved, or will it change the view of the threat posed by the Houthis? So, for example, 2 years ago, the Biden administration ended the classification of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. This led to a shift on the process on the ground. And then 2 years later, many of the actors in Washington are now seeing that this group is taking dangerous steps in the region. Will this lead to various impacts, including the Houthis, for example, being classified as a terrorist organization? I think these issues are all being discussed. How will the international community deal with the Houthis, the threats that the Houthis pose, and also not taking or falling in line with the traditional or stereotypical roles of the region? I think this role has changed, and this axis has been escalatory in nature, has been taking risks, and so I think this involvement of the Houthis might lead. It changes the view of how the Yemeni file can be settled after this new role being taken. What do you think the Israeli or the American response will be if this escalation by the Houthis continue? Do you think that we might see attacks targeting Houthi leaders, for example? I think that the response will depend on what the Houthis do. If the Houthis continue with these symbolic messages, there might be targeting of some of their military capacities, maybe arms storages. But if the Houthis escalate, we will see two levels of responses: political response and a military response. The political response might include rethinking the classification of the Houthis as a terrorist group, and we'll see more, I think we could say, violent responses, including the targeting of the Houthi leaders and some of the IGRC commanders in Yemen, and this will be a clear response from the Israelis and Americans. And so the type of response from Israel and the United States will depend on to what extent the Houthis will go in their involvement in the war. What are the military capabilities of this group at this time? Do you have any information on that? It's clear that the military capacity of the Houthis is still not a strategic threat, does not pose a strategic threat to Israel, but I think it represents a risk, not a strategic threat that could damage the security structure. They have missiles that could have a range of 2,000 kilometers. There is talk of even longer range than that. But if they are launched towards Israel, they will have to be launched from the southern parts of the west coast. And we've seen that the drones and missiles that were launched at the beginning, some of them fell in the areas of Taba and Unayba and the Republic of Egypt. We also saw some of the missile wreckage in areas in Jordan. And so the capability of the Houthis to pose a threat, or the missile capabilities, are limited, but I think this war will be an opportunity for them to test these capabilities and to continue to develop them. Thank you very much, Majid. We will come back with a few more questions, but I wanted to move on to the second topic, the track of the conflict with the ongoing escalation with you, Yazid. The current escalation with the members of the Axis and with the increasing military operations by the Israelis in Gaza, this has reiterated the red lines that Iran has tried to impose since the beginning of the operation Al-Aqsa Typhoon. There were two red lines. First, not allowing any direct U.S. military intervention, whether in Gaza or southern Lebanon, and also not allowing any broad ground defensive to remove Tehran's allies in
ما
Gaza.
هي حدود الإمكانيات العسكرية للجانب الإيراني ومحور
What
المقاومة
are the
تابع
military
لطهران في مواجهة
capabilities
إسرائيل
of the
والولايات
Iranians
المتحدة؟
and the axis of
هل
resistance
يمكن
in
أن تنحصر
confronting Israel and the
المعارك
United
في
States?
معارك
Could the
ردع واستنزاف
battles
على جبهات مختلفة
be
ضد
limited
محور
to battles
المقاومة
of
أو
attrition
هذا
by the
بحد
members
ذاته
of the
ممكن
axis
يهدد
against
بمزيد من
Israel and the United
التصعيد
States?
الإقليمي أو
And could
يمكن أن
this lead
نشهد
to
مواجهة
further
مباشرة ما بين
escalation,
إيران
or could this
وإسرائيل
lead
أو
to
أمريكا؟
direct confrontation between Iran, Israel, and the United States?
سؤال طبعا ضروري.
I think this is a very important
طبعا
question. A few seconds, please.
عفوا كان في تعطيل هون على جنب. سؤال مهم بس رح أتناوله بطريقة شوي
This is a very
مختلفة.
important question, but I'm going to be addressing it a bit
يعني بعتقد
differently.
أولاً
I think first
إنه
that
إيران ما عندها
Iran
رغبة
does not
بالتصعيد
have
أو
the
بالوصول
desire
إلى
to
الصدام
escalate
المباشر
or
بينها
to
وبين
get into
إسرائيل أو بينها
direct
وبين
clashes
القوات
between it
الأمريكية
and
أولاً.
Israel or it and American forces. And that's the first point. The
بعتقد
second,
أكثر من ذلك إنه
and more than that, I think that Iran will be very hesitant to involve Hezbollah or to push Hezbollah to clash with Israel. Obviously, things could develop and things could change on the ground, and this includes if the ground offensive, Israeli ground offensive in Gaza expands, or if it seems like they will be successful in severely damaging or even destroying the Hamas movement. But based on the current situation, I have believed and continue to believe that Hezbollah does not want to get involved in fighting with Israel. And this also means that Iran does not want Hezbollah to get involved in direct clashes. One of the most important reasons for this is that Iran has built and invested in Hezbollah's military capabilities and in building up its alliance with Hezbollah in Lebanon as a strategic deterrent to Israel, to deter Israel or the United States from trying to confront Iran militarily. And so it's difficult for me to imagine that Iran would risk this very important and strategic card that Hezbollah represents, even if to preserve the Hamas movement. There are two priorities. The first is to maintain the Iranian strategic deterrence, and I don't think Iran will give that up very easily. But on the other hand, I think that there are two factors that need to be mentioned here. The first, I believe and have believed that the decision to go into war will not be a decision made by Hezbollah, and it will not be a decision, an Iranian decision based on what we see now on the ground. If there is a war, if a war starts between Israel and Hezbollah, it will be based on an Israeli decision to start this war. And this is not because Israel is hostile or any of that. There's another important aspect that we need to keep in mind here, is that the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is in a very difficult political position internally. He's accused by what seems like a majority among the Israeli public, or among the Israeli Jewish Israelis. Majority believe that Netanyahu is the reason for these shortcomings and that he must vacate office. And Netanyahu is someone who very clearly throughout his political career is someone who tries as much as possible to survive. And so he resorts to this escalation rhetoric. He's talked about the extermination of the Palestinians. He mentions, he quotes the Torah talking about killing every man, woman, and child, and cows and horses and everything. And so this genocidal rhetoric is more targeted towards his grassroots support, especially the right wing and the religiously conservative, because he's thinking about his political future after these military operations end. And so his escalation in Gaza serves that internal political purpose, and we might reach a point, if he feels like he's still facing a threat to his political career, he might resort to escalating with Hezbollah in order to continue moving forward and not allow
ولو
these
صار في تصعيد
operations to stop.
فلسطيني بمعنى
If
انه
there
صار
is
في
regional escalation,
اقتربنا من
meaning that
نظام مباشر بين
if
اسرائيل
we see that
وايران
there
او
might be a
بين
direct
القوات الامريكيه
confrontation between Israel
منتشره
and
في
Iran
منطقتنا
or the
وايران
American forces throughout the region
يعني
and
احنا
Iran,
مغفلين هون انه بهالحاله
but I think in
الصراع
that
هذا
point we're
ببطل حتى
ignoring
صراع
that
بس
this
ايراني
conflict
امريكي
will not just be an
بل
Iranian-American
مفترض انا
conflict.
انه روسيا بهي اللحظه
I think at that
حتتحرك
point
مش
Russia will get
عسكريا
involved,
بس
not necessarily militarily,
بتخيل
but
انها
I believe that,
يعني تبدي
or I would
معارضه
imagine that
بشكل
Russia
شديد
will
لاي
express
يعني
its clear
توجه عسكري ضد
opposition to
ايران
any military
حتتكلم عن
operations
الدفاع عن
or actions
ايران
against
حليف
Iran.
ايراني
Will
اللي عم
talk about
بيساعدها في اوكرانيا
defending
وبعتبر هو من
Iran and its
الصين
ally
اللي
currently in
اتخذت
Ukraine. And I think
موقف
that
محايد
China, which has
يعني اكثر مما كنت
taken
بتوقع لانه
a
الصين
much more
اقتربت كثير
neutral
من اسرائيل في
position than I've
السنين
imagined, because
الاخيره
China has gotten much closer to Israel over the past
ولكن
years.
خلال الحرب
But
الدائره اليوم في
over the
غزه
ongoing conflict
الصين
today in
اخذت
Gaza,
موقف اكثر مؤيد للفلسطينيين
China has
مما
taken a
كان
position that is
متوقع
more
ولو
supportive
صار
of,
في
of the
يعني
Palestinians than would have
مخاطر
been
اصطدام
expected.
بين
And if
امريكا
there are
وايران او بين اسرائيل وايران
possibilities of clashes
اعتقد انه
between
الصين
Israel and
حتتحرك
Iran
ولو
or
فقط
America and
دبلوماسيا
Iran,
ولكن
then I think
حتتحرك
China will
وتتخذ
take actions, even if just
لهجه
diplomatically,
ونبره
or
دبلوماسيه
will
اشد
use
مما قبل
much
دفاعا
harsher
عن
diplomatic
فعليا يعني عمليا
discourse
عن ايران
in
فاذا
defending Iran.
التداعيات لن تقتصر
And
على
so I
امريكا
think the
وايران
repercussions will not
لو
just be
وصلنا
limited
الى
to
هذه
the
النقطه.
US and Iran if we get to that
أوكي، في
point.
سياق النقطة
Thank you
الأخيرة اللي
very
أشرت
much.
لها
Based on
أستاذ
that
يزيد
last
عن
point
موضوع
that you've mentioned,
دور دبلوماسي أكبر
Yazid,
صيني
about
أو أخذت
a
المنافسة
larger Chinese
الاستراتيجية
diplomatic
الأمريكية مع
role,
روسيا والصين حيز
the
مركزي في
competition
علاقة
between the
الولايات
United
المتحدة
States
دول
and
المنطقة
Russia and
وتحديدا
China have
الخليج.
played an important role in the region,
هل
especially
هذا
among the Gulf
ممكن أنه
states.
نشهد
Do
انفتاح
you think
أكبر
that we
على
might
دور
see
دبلوماسي صيني في المنطقة
a
لخفض
larger
تصعيد
opportunity
هذا الصراع بالتحديد؟
for a Chinese diplomatic role in the region to
انا يعني
de-escalate
الحقيقه
this conflict?
يمكن زميلنا عبد الله
I
بعبود
think
هو
our
اكثر
colleague
عن اجابه
Abdullah
في هذا
Baboud
السؤال.
might be
انا
able to
من جهتي
discuss
اللي فيني
this or
اضيفه
answer this
فقط
question more. But the only point I wanted to
انه
add is
اعتقد
that
انه روسيا
I
والصين
think that Russia and
بالوضع
China
تقريبا مثل ما كانوا عام 2011
are in the same situation that they
2012
were in 2011,
لما
or a similar
استمر الربيع
situation to
العربي
2011, 2012, when the Arab Spring started.
وبعدين طبعا حصل ما حصل في ليبيا
And
وحصل
what
تدخل
happened
حلف
in
الناتو
Libya
في ليبيا.
happened, and NATO got
شعرت
involved
روسيا
in
والى
Libya.
حد ما اعتقد
Russia, and
الصين
to a
معها
certain extent China
انه
as
حلف
well,
الناتو استغل
felt that NATO
التفويض
took
الاممي
advantage of the UN
للتدخل في
mandate,
ليبيا للايقاعها
or the
بنظام
international
عربي
mandate, to get
وهذا
involved in
ادى
Libya and
الى
to lead
موقف
to the fall of an
عاكس في
Arab regime. And this
سوريا
led
حيث
to
روسيا تدخلت
a
مباشرة من
response
خلال
in Syria,
استخدام
where Russia got involved
النقد
directly
الفيتو في الأمم
through
المتحدة
the use of
وأيضا من
their
خلال
veto
الدعم العسكري
in the
المباشر
UN
لنظام بشار
Security Council, and
الأسد.
also providing direct
يعني
military
بمعنى
support to Bashar al-Assad's
تعلموا من
regime.
درس ليبيا
And so I
ضمن
think they learned
تكرار
from what
نفس
happened in
المشهد في
Libya to
سوريا
not allow
اليوم.
the same thing to happen in Syria.
روسيا والصين
Today, Russia and
متعاطفين
China
متعاطفهم مع
have
الفلسطينيين
expressed
بمعنى
their empathy
يعني
with what the
معارضة
Palestinians are going
قتل
through, and that their
المدنيين الفلسطينيين بهذا
opposition to
الشكل
the
من
killing
قبل
of
إسرائيل
Palestinian civilians in this way by
ومثل
Israel.
ما شاهدنا بالماضي
And
يعني
just like we saw in the
موقفهم
past,
في غزة
their
نوعا ما
position in
حيادي خلينا
Gaza
نقول
has been
لكن لو شعروا
somewhat neutral.
انه
But if they feel that
حيشجع حلف
this
الناتو او
will
الولايات المتحدة
encourage NATO
على
or the
الاصطدام
United
بإيران
States
حيعتبروا هذا
to clash
وكأنه
with Iran, they
تكرار
will see this
تجربة
as
ليبيا في سوريا
a repeat of
واليوم
what happened
تكرار
in
تجربة
Libya.
غزة في إيران.
And that what
فأعتقد
happened in Gaza
انه
is
حيصير في
that
تسارع
there's going to be an
بالأحداث
attempt to
لو
expand that
فعلا
into Iran. And so I
صار
think things will
في
develop very
تصعيد من هذا
rapidly
النوع
if there is
ولو أن
any
الولايات
escalation of this
المتحدة
sort,
تجاوزت
and if the
سقف
United
معين.
States
فإذا الولايات المتحدة
crosses
اليوم
or goes
عم
beyond a
تردع إيران
certain limit. Today, the
ولكن هي
United
أيضا
States
في
is trying to
أمامها
deter
قيود
Iran, but it
لا
also
تستطيع
is facing
بسهولة أن
limitations, and it cannot
تتجاوزها.
very
ويمكن هذا
easily
بيؤدينا أيضا لاستنتاج
overcome them. And I think this
إنه
could
يعني ننصت
lead us to
خلينا
the
نقول الإدارة
conclusion
الأمريكية
that
بأنه
we should be fair in this
ردعها
regard to the
لإيران
American
هو أيضا
administration, that
نوع
their
من
deterrence of
التطمين
Iran is an
والتقييد
attempt to
للخيارات
also
الإسرائيلية. يعني دخولهم بهذا الشكل
reassure
مش
the
بس
Israeli options. Their
بيودي
involvement in this way
رسالة
doesn't
لإيران إنه
just
لا
give a message
تتدخلي
to
لا
Iran that they should
تصعدي،
not get
بس
involved or
أيضا هو
should not
رسالة
escalate, but it's
لإسرائيل
also a
إنه
message to
مش
Israel
بحاجة
that
أنتوا تصعدوا
you do
فما
not need
تصعدوا.
to further escalate, so
فيعني
do not
أظن
do
في
that.
نوع من الرسالة
And so I
الموجهة
think
المزدوجة
it's
هون
an
من قبل
implied
الإدارة الأمريكية
message
أيضا.
by the American administration
أوكي،
to both
سؤال أخير
sides.
قبل ما أنتقل
Thank you very
للمحاضر
much. One
الثاني أستاذ
final
يزيد،
question before we
من
move on
تسوية
to
الصراع
the
الفلسطيني
third speaker. The settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a more comprehensive comprehensive way depends on the United States and Western actors' ability to manage a foreign policy that is relatively neutral and principle-based. How are we to understand the clear support expressed in Washington and by other Western actors and their support for Israel and the violations being committed in Gaza? And with the threat that this conflict might expand to in the region, could they push seriously towards a two-state solution?
الحقيقة يعني رغم إنه
Despite
ابتدى الحديث في الغرب وخاصة
despite that
في الولايات
these
المتحدة
talks
من قبل
in the US and in the West in general, but by the American administration about the importance of going back to a serious political track and reviving the two-state solution. But I do not think that the developments that we have seen on the ground, not now, not in 6 months, or not any time in the foreseeable future, will allow any return to a serious political track, whether it will lead to a two-state solution or whatever other agreed upon settlement could be reached between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I think this is for several reasons. First, let's go back 25 years to when the EU and the Council of Europe issued in the Berlin Statement in March 1998, issued a statement on the issue of Palestine and Israel, and they reiterated their unconditional support for an establishment of a Palestinian state, whether through negotiations and even without negotiations and without the approval or acceptance of Israel. This was a very clear position that was taken and could not be misread. But now when we see the European response, there's nothing that we see today that reminds us of that statement, not by the response by the governments, whether the French or the British or the Italian, or even at the collective response by Europe. Europe is completely absent today and has actually even started to use a discourse where even attempting to implement a ceasefire in Gaza is not among their list of demands. And so I think we're very far from this kind of solution. The changes that have occurred over the past 25 years, Western societies, with the increasing rise of the right wing, especially extremist right wing that are racist, that are against people of color, of Muslims, against women's rights. There is a very right wing discourse spreading throughout the West, in Germany, in France. When Emmanuel Macron leaves, or Marie Le Pen will be competing for the presidency. She actually has a chance, and so this rise reminds us of the years with before the Second World War, with the rise of Hitler and Mussolini, and the moderate or conservative parties have started to see their influence regress, with the right wings starting to take over, and then eventually taking over Germany. And so this violent and racist right wing is rising in the West, and we've also seen a regression of more moderate political actors. It has become much easier for them to use Palestinians as a sacrificial lamb, of giving up and showing their solidarity with Israel, despite the fact that Israel is governed by a right wing, some of whom even call themselves fascists. But we still see this unconditional, unquestioning solidarity and support with Israel. And so I don't think that there is any Western government, even the American administration, that is prepared to truly invest the necessary political capital to pressure Israel, which has become more right-wing than ever. I don't see who is going to be putting the necessary weight to change the Israeli position. If there are changes, it will have to come from Israeli society itself, as well as Palestinian society. But other than that, I see that all of the developments in Israel, in Palestine, in the West, and in the international community do not show that this is where we're heading. I think we're heading towards broader confrontations and clashes around the world and even in the West. And so this this issue of the Palestinian state, I think, is an issue that maybe 20, 30, even 50 or 60 years in the future will not
شكرا
resolve.
جزيلا أستاذ يزيد.
Thank you very much, Yazid. Thomas, we'll now hear from you, and we'll hear about the third topic, which is the trend among coalitions or alliances in the region. Like Yazid said, in the absence of American support or support by the West towards supporting the two-state solution, with this vague situation that we see today and also the numerous political tracks, do you think that regional actors, especially influential regional actors, specifically Saudi Arabia, will reassess their geopolitical alliances, and what might that bring them closer to Iran or closer to the Chinese Russian axis?
Thank you, and thank you very much for organizing this event. I think that the first honest answer to a question like that has got to be a word of caution and humility in trying to answer it, in the sense that at this early stage, when the war, the invasion or ground incursions of Gaza are barely starting, that it's very difficult to try to see what might be the regional consequences after the war, whatever after the war actually means. And I'm not saying that to cop out of the answer, but I think it is important to always start with a word of caution or humility like that. From Saudi Arabia's perspective, one of the debates that we're hearing a lot now is what does it mean in terms of normalization with Israel? There were a lot of media reports prior to October 7th, whereby Israel and Saudi Arabia might have been somewhat more or less close to a normalization agreement. Does this make it more or less difficult? Keeping in mind my point about having to wait a bit before coming up with any definitive answer, I think in the short term, it's pretty clear that this is taking us, and that's pretty much stating the obvious, taking us away from a Saudi-Israel normalization agreement, at least as long as the war is going on. I do think that there is a scenario after this ends, keeping in mind that we have no idea when or how this ends, whereby the incentive for Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel, provided that this comes with security guarantees with the US, that incentive actually increases because of the growing threat perception of Iran and its network of armed groups, chiefly Hamas, but as we discussed notably with Maged in the first round of questions, the Houthis coming into the conflict in such a meaningful and unprecedented way. In addition, one of the stumbling blocks, if we believe what was being read in the media, was the reluctance by the US to go as far as Saudi Arabia wanted to in terms of providing it with security guarantees as part of a broader triangular deal between the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. You could imagine that the US being less reluctant after this to provide at least some of these security guarantees to Saudi Arabia. All of them, I seriously doubt it, but more than as of 3.5 weeks ago, that's quite likely. So I do see a scenario, far from 100%, but I do see a scenario once the dust settles where Israel-Saudi normalization not only resumes, but might even become more likely. The other alliance that or pattern of cooperation or non-cooperation that I'd refer to in terms of answering your question is Saudi and Iran. There was a lot of talk in the months before October 7th of reconciliation of some kind between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by China. The role of China brokering that, by the way, I find has been significantly exaggerated by a number of interpretations in the media. I think it was a much smaller role than is often made to be. I've always been very skeptical of Saudi-Iran reconciliation. I don't think it was a reconciliation by any stretch. It was a cautious, informal agreement to try to better manage some of the tensions between the two of them. And I'm really caveating that statement in multiple ways. It wasn't more than that. If you wanted to be optimistic, you could say that it might be a first step towards more efforts towards confidence building. But I was even somewhat skeptical at that level. And basically, these efforts, as limited as I viewed them, are smashed right now.
شكرا توماس. إذا قبل 7 أكتوبر
Thank you,
كما
Thomas.
ذكرت، ركزت
Before October
الدبلوماسية
7th, like you
الخارجية
said,
أو دبلوماسية السياسة الخارجية السعودية ربما
the
على
Saudi
ثلاثة
foreign
مسارات على
policy
الصعيد
focused on
الإقليمي:
three main tracks
تقاربها
at the
أو المصالح
regional
العلاقة
level.
مع إيران،
First, the
إنهاء
rapprochement
انخراطها
or
في حرب
reconciliation
اليمن
with Iran.
والتطبيع
When it
مع
comes to that,
إسرائيل،
ending their
مع
involvement in Yemen,
تداعيات هذه
and
الحرب
also
في غزة
normalization with
تصبح
Israel. With the
السعودية قادرة
repercussions
على
of this war in
الموازنة ما
Gaza,
بين هذه
will
المسارات
Saudi Arabia
الثلاثة،
be able
ولا
to
يؤدي
balance
مثلا
between these three
تفضيلها لمسار
tracks,
معين
or will they
إلى حدوث
prioritize a
نتائج
certain
عكسية
track
في
until
ملفات أخرى؟
something happens?
That's also a good and difficult question to try to answer. On the Israel normalization side, I think I touched that in the first question. I do think that there's a good likelihood that Saudi Arabia will feel a strong incentive to resume that track, those efforts to normalize with Israel. On the issue of withdrawing from Yemen, I think that the Saudi calculus, and again, keeping in mind that things could change a lot, I think that the Saudi calculus to want to withdraw from the war in Yemen as much as possible will continue. I mean, Saudi Arabia has been trying to withdraw from the war in Yemen for quite some time now and has simply not been able to do it. Part of the challenge here, and I've written for the Sana Center on this issue, is that basically Saudi Arabia has lost the war in Yemen, and it is trying to negotiate its withdrawal in a way that minimizes its losses. But that's very difficult to do. And the Houthis, having understood correctly, I think, that they have won the war politically and militarily, they are making sure that they're extracting maximal concessions from Saudi Arabia in that withdrawal in a way that is, so far at least, unacceptable for Saudi Arabia. That fundamental dynamic is not only not going to change as a result of what is going on in Gaza, if anything, and keeping in mind my word of caution from 3 minutes ago, that dynamic is arguably reinforced by current events, by what we are seeing as the Houthis being willing to be engaged, as was mentioned very well in previous answers, outside of the scope of or the parameters of the war in Yemen. That will confirm, that will entrench the perception that Saudi Arabia has lost the war. The simple fact that the Houthis are doing this right now, in launching missile and drone strikes on Israel, is a massive symbolic and political slap in the face of Saudi Arabia. And that message, I find, is being heard loud and clear. As Magid very well said, from a strategic military perspective, this is not a significant threat to Israel if you take these missiles or drones individually. The broader message that they send on the other hand, is significant.
Yes, but Saudi Arabia is continuing, and I think that this is could happen with the normalization Israel. How could Saudi Arabia try to marginalize the threat posed by the Houthis towards Saudi Arabia with the continued threats?
That's a very good question, and I don't have an answer to that, in the sense that Saudi Arabia has tried to do that for years and has not only not been able to, but that threat has increased as a result of Iranian support to the Houthis, missiles and drones. There's no way that the Houthis would have been able to do what they've done 3 times towards Israel in the last 3 weeks. But as much as we talk a lot about how Iran has provided significant support to the Houthis, and which is absolutely true. The other half of the equation that explains Saudi Arabia's failure in the war, in addition to Iranian support to the Houthis, is the complete inability to stand up an anti-Houthi front in Yemen. I mean, Houthi power comes primarily from the weakness of its local adversaries, and not only from Iranian support. We've seen the Presidential Leadership Council stood up by Saudi Arabia a bit more than about a year and a half ago now, having completely failed to offer a viable, united, competent, not corrupt alternative, an alternative power center that could actually stand up to the Houthis, and that has completely failed. So the answer to your question would be, well, a Presidential Leadership Council that works as a counterweight to the Houthis militarily and politically, but we have simply not seen that. Is there a strategy to fundamentally reverse that dynamic? I have simply not seen it.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So what might make Iran change its behavior or its policies, being mixed with mixing the carrot and stick approach? They're striving to work on escalating the security situation and also showing what threats that they could pose, especially through the Houthis, while also showing that Tehran is open to cooperating with Gulf states and attempt to re-engineer and rebalance regional engagements.
Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
Shukran. So that's also a very good question, and here I have to say that I'm what I'm going to say is in line with what Yazid said in the previous answer when he was referring specifically to his assessment on Hezbollah's calculus on the prospect of escalation. I think there's a similar argument that can be made that I would share, though cautiously, because the situation is so volatile and uncertain on the Iranian side. One way that we can interpret Iran's views or calculus right now is that Iran, in many ways, has won. The curve of the gains that it has made in the current situation might be close to its peak right now. So, from Iran's perspective, there might be a calculus here of saying, well, we've made some gains. We've demonstrated, we've demonstrated through Hamas, through the support that we've provided Hamas. I don't think, by the way, that Iran ordered Hamas to do this, but as an ally, still there's a gain for Iran here. The weakness, the unpreparedness, the intelligence and policy failure on the Israeli side, we can fully expect that Iran will absolutely try to leverage that what it views as a significant loss by Israel. From a soft power perspective in the coming months and years for that matter. But now the more Hamas is weakened in the fighting that comes, the more Israel sees one of its key partners being weakened. Exactly what Yazid says in terms of losing potentially, or at least in part losing Hezbollah, which is the strategic reserve for Iran in terms of an eventual confrontation on the nuclear program with Israel and the US. So Iran at this point will not openly call for and openly act towards a ceasefire. It will continue to ramp up the rhetoric. It will continue to use its rhetoric to corner Israel, to pressure Israel, to embarrass Israel, to try to wean Israel away from a number of regional partners who are in a very uncomfortable position now: Oman, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others. Iran will try to will keep the pressure on Israel through Hezbollah, through the Houthis, to corner Israel, to try to prevent it from fully concentrating on Hamas. But I don't think that it wants the escalation that we are all so afraid of. Does it mean 100% there will be no escalation? No, absolutely not. I may be wrong in assessing that these are Iran's intentions, which is absolutely conceivable. Or even if I am correct and Yazid is correct on the Hezbollah side, there may be an unwanted escalation that Iran and Hezbollah and presumably Israel also do not want, simply because the situation is so volatile. So I do think that's Iran's calculus at this point, but it's by no means guaranteed.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you very much. Maysa, we'll move on to you with the fourth point, the future of the Houthi-Saudi negotiations, especially with the changes that have occurred in the region. These developments, could they lead to a regression in the negotiations between the Houthis and Saudis? There was reports of a significant attack by the Houthis on Mount Dud that ended with 5 Saudi soldiers being killed. There were also some who linked Saudi's attack on the Houthi attack on the Saudi border with the signing of the Manama agreement, and this was an attack on Bahraini soldiers or military personnel. There was also an unknown armed group who is called the Movement to Liberate the Two Holy Places, and this group is seen as a wing or as being supported by the Houthis. Before we go into the repercussions of the current war on the Houthi-Saudi talks, based on your background and knowledge of the ideology, do you think that their expansion, that regional expansion, is a part of the Houthi ideology?
الجميع. شكرا كثير يا إلهام.
Thank you very much, Ilham.
طبعا بداية السؤال يعني
The beginning of the question, I think, was is a very interesting topic. But with regards to the Houthis, from the very beginning of the 2000s, at the same time as Yemen becoming more and more involved with the war on terror after the attack on the USS Cole in September 2000, and then obviously the September 11th attacks, and then afterwards the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And so this period was a very decisive period in the region. There was a lot of tensions, and Hussein al-Houthi, the founder of the Houthis, focused a lot on the war on terror, and he was attacking the Yemeni government as being an agent of the United States in the West, and he attacked Israel and the United States. And he had this idea of he used the discourse of the clash of civilizations between the West and Islam. And for him, this seemed like an inevitable result. The Houthi movement from its beginnings viewed Iran as viewed itself as a part of the Iranian axis. Hussein al-Houthi would always refer to Hussein Nasrallah and al-Khomeini as important references, and as the only serious actors in fighting against Israel and the United States, unlike Osama bin Laden, who he believed was created by American intelligence. The Houthi movement is a part of the Zaydi sect. It is a small Shi'i sect that has a presence in Yemen, and so they always reiterate their Shia identity more than their local Zaydi identity. And this is something that is unprecedented in Yemen's history with regards to the many Zaydi movements that have been active and influential in Yemen, in Yemen's modern history and even in the past. And so them reiterating this identity, or this dimension of their identity as a Shia movement, shows their desire to be closely linked to Iran and its axis. And so this war, as a part of their slogan, which is obviously very anti-American, very anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish, this was their opportunity to actually show that they were serious about this. They're serious about fighting, because this was always something that Yemenis sarcastically would talk about, that the Houthis haven't killed a single American or a single Israeli and have only been killing Yemenis over the past years because of their involvement in this long civil war, in addition to their involvement in the region. With regards to their reaching agreement with Saudi Arabia, before this most recent escalation in Gaza, had kept itself neutral in an attempt to present itself as a state that is stable with regards to its security and economically, and to start working on Vision 2030 and to market itself in a completely different way from the view of it during the war in Yemen and the Khashoggi affair, and Saudi Arabia's reputation at the international level was greatly affected by this. And so this was a part of Saudi Arabia's desire to finally close the Yemeni file, and also them knowing that stopping the attacks, the drone and missile attacks by the Houthis, would be very costly, and would also be very costly for its reputation politically. And so Saudi Arabia needed to finally move on, and so it went directly to Iran, because it's recognized that the Iranians had influence over the Houthis, especially on this issue. And it reached an agreement with Iran, and this has kept it relatively neutral. It's true that there are some implied messages from the Houthis against Saudi Arabia from the beginning of the Gaza war, especially over the past week. There have been some implied attacks, and they've become harsher by saying, for example, the Arab states that support Israel, or the Arab states that have not tried to deter Israel, and other messages by the Houthis, some of which very clearly imply Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, but specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And we should also not forget that when they struck the UAE, when they conducted an attack on the UAE, this was the day after the visit by the Israeli president to the UAE. This was in January 2022. There was obviously internal reasons. This was due to UAE allied forces participating in the fight against the Houthis while trying to expand to Shabwa. But the Houthis tried to market this attack as being an attempt to target the UAE for its normalization with Israel. And so they tried to give it a regional dimension, despite the fact that there was primarily a local reason or factor behind this attack against the UAE. And so it depends to what extent Saudi Arabia will be able to remain or keep itself neutral in this conflict, whether in the short term or the long term. To what extent also the nature, what, and also what, where this conflict will develop. I think the war militarily will not expand much, at least in the short term, but I think in the long run, it will affect the region as a whole. And this might lead to the region becoming divided into an Iranian axis and an anti-Iranian axis. I think this is one of the potential scenarios that we might see. And Saudi Arabia, because of its close security ties to the West, if it places itself within this axis, then all attempts to reach an agreement with Iran or with the Houthis might collapse. But as of now, I don't think that this is likely. I think that there are threats of violence, but not any real escalation that might stall all of these tracks. At least that's what we see now. Iran, through the Houthis becoming directly involved in the war, I think Iran is using gradual escalation. And the Houthis are the easiest and least influential cards that Iran has to use against Israel. I think it's an attempt to show what threats they could pose, and the Houthi card is the one that is furthest away from Israel and from the war. But this escalation could gradually develop to Hezbollah becoming involved, and Hezbollah being the Iranian ally who poses the most threat towards Israel. But this still hasn't happened. There were a few clashes on the border, and they've happened a lot. They've happened several times during the negotiations. But I think this is due to the fact that the Houthis are also trying to convey the message that they have not given up on the war and that they can continue fighting. It's also maybe an attempt to improve or to gain leverage in their negotiations, but not necessarily to stall these negotiations. I haven't heard that the negotiations have completely stalled. They've been suspended, but haven't stopped. But we haven't heard from any of the actors that these negotiations have completely ended, and it depends on what will happen with the developments of the war. There are reports, and you could confirm this, Mesa, if they're true. Are there divisions within the group, within the Houthis, between the more extremists who want to escalate against Saudi Arabia? It's very clear that the closer Saudi Arabia got to normalization with Israel, this would lead to further complications with its involvement in Yemen. And whenever it got closer to Iran, the more likely it was to de-escalate. And so where do you think the Houthis will head in this coming period, especially in their negotiations with Saudi Arabia? There are movements or wings within the Houthis, but first of all, this is a very disciplined group. And decisions are made by a single person. Decisions are unified. The decision-making process is unified. And so there are always divisions. There are always different ideas, but the decisions are made by a single person. And these divisions, if we assume that there are truly divisions, there's always part of the Houthis that wanted to reconcile with Saudi Arabia and being more open to the countries of the region and the other Yemeni actors. And this wing, I believe, is not very influential within the Houthis, but it is there. And from time to time, it could lead to breakthroughs from within the group. But the more important movement, and this is a military movement at its core, and since its foundation and the way that it was formed, this group was formed during the Saudi Wars, and since it was founded, it's been involved in conflicts at both the local and regional levels, and so the group has not stopped fighting. And this has increased its military capabilities, while its political capabilities are still very modest and very limited, because this movement does not have a political history that, for example, Hezbollah has, because it had a political history before it developed into what we currently see as Hezbollah. Hezbollah. The Houthis, on the other hand, are a group that has had a very strong military dimension since the beginning, and so the military wing is very important and very influential with the decision maker, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, and is the one most influenced by Iran, because Iran was the primary supporter of the Houthis. It would provide them with arms, it would give them support and training, and if not for Iran, I don't think the Houthis would have been able to remain resilient for this long. I think because militarily they were the weaker actor in Yemen. And so this wing within the Houthis is more influential on Abdul Malik al-Houthi's decision making. Even Abdul Malik al-Houthi is someone who has not been involved in politics. He has a military background. And so this wing is reliant in large part on Iranian decision-making and calculus, and this is obviously influenced by the regional conflicts, whether it's conflict with Israel or the competition and conflict with Saudi Arabia. And so it depends on what repercussions of this war will look like. I think this war militarily might be limited in geographic scope, but in the long run, I think that all options remain on the table, and there's a lot of potential scenarios. So with all of these potential scenarios, one final question before we move on to Abdullah Ba'aboud. The peace or the truce with Saudi Arabia, does it serve the Houthis? And is it an attempt to try to rally the grassroots support around the Palestinian cause? Mesa? I'm sorry, I thought you were asking the question to Abdullah, so I didn't hear it. I was saying before we move on to Abdullah. Do you think that a peace or a truce with Saudi Arabia, would it serve the Houthis, especially with the grassroots rallying around the Palestinian cause and the use of this cause in their discourse? Yes, Yemenis are very supportive of the Palestinian cause. And even with all of the different conflicts or the different debates and questions that they might have about Hamas, for example, being close to Iran or close to the Muslim Brotherhood, I think Yemenis have always been supporters of the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people. This is a very emotional issue for them. It's also linked to the religious and the pan-Arabist sensibilities. If I think some Yemenis might feel like, what do we have to do with Israel, and what would be the added value by Yemen being involved? This might be some of the responses by some who are skeptical of this position, but like I said, the Houthis still find that there is a lot of support at the grassroots level. There's still a lot of support for this response, but not everyone will respond seriously or take these messages seriously. I don't know to what extent this will actually increase the popularity of the Houthis, which had been decreasing since the beginning of the ceasefire. The ceasefire started in April 2022, and until now, it's been on a year and a half. The Houthis are facing real challenges with popular discontent. There were demonstrations and protests against the Houthis, and the Houthis faced things that they did not think they would face this quickly after the hostilities and the war stalled. The Houthis are good fighters, but very bad administrators, and their legitimacy is based on this idea of the external aggression or Saudi intervention, and was not based on their ability to govern or to provide services or to secure the interests of the people. And so despite the security repression and the police state that they have built in Yemen, they're still facing challenges. Could this lead to a rise in their stock? I think this will take some time to see if it will actually lead to more popular support. It might lead to more support for the axis of resistance and Iran as a whole, but it all depends on what and where the war develops and what ends up happening. Thank you very much, Mesa. We'll now move on to Abdullah Ba'aboud on the fifth and final topic with the efforts of the Gulf states and their ability to de-escalate. Could the internal security of Gulf states be affected by the escalation in Gaza, especially since these states rely primarily on the United States, which is currently being viewed as facilitating Israeli attacks on Gaza?
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much,
إلهام. شكرا على
Ilham.
الدعوة.
Thank you very much for your invitation for me to participate.
أعتقد أن أي يعني حرب مثل هذا بحجم
I believe that a war such as this one will definitely, a war of this size will definitely have an impact on the states in the region, and it will have significant repercussions. But like all of the other speakers have said, it depends to what extent this war will continue, what its results will be, and what will actually end up happening. Any imbalance in power between the actors in the region, or any developments in this war, could impact the Gulf states, which might be in agreement in that they're trying to maintain security and stability in the region because they are primarily focused now on economic development and also the post-oil economies and other trends. There are differing opinions for each one of these Gulf states, but most of their focus is on development now. And any negative developments in the region will definitely have an impact on all of these plans. And so from that perspective, this war could have an impact on the Gulf. And also from another perspective, there's a lot of popular support for the cause, especially in light of the Israeli strikes on Gaza and the attempt to destroy Hamas and the increasing number of casualties. Also the types of arms that are being used and how they're being used, the killing of children, what we've seen in the news over the past few weeks. This makes the peoples of the region raise their voices. And it's true that the Gulf states are not democratic states where the people actually have a significant role in changing government policies. But we must not forget that the governments in the region have to take into account what the opinion of the people is, and this might impact security in the region overall. We've seen that there were several protests in several countries in the region, and they might develop even further than that. There is a fear that there might be another Arab Spring that would also impact the region. And like the speakers have said before me, there's a sense, there's a lot of concern and fear among the people of the region, and fear of what this war could lead to. And this could have a significant impact on the security in the region. And this comes at a time of important transformations at the international level. We see the rise of China. We see also the impact of the war in Ukraine. And also what some might see as lesser concern by Europe and by specifically the United States for the region, and less focus in the region. And this has made the countries of the region face eastwards more than they were facing, more than west. There were also some disputes between the American administration and the Gulf states for several reasons. I don't think we need to go into details now, but all of these developments make the Gulf states in a very vague situation where they don't know where they are heading, and especially the countries that have signed the Abraham Accords. These countries are now in a very difficult position with their people, and also with the other countries in the region. They can't. These accords have not been able to achieve what they had hoped that they would achieve. They hoped that they would lead to a two-state solution and a peaceful settlement of the Palestinian issue, but all of this was not achieved, and these countries are now in a very difficult position. And we've even seen some of the rhetoric and discourse being changed by countries in the region. I think that we're seeing now the region going through a very dangerous stage. I think it could lead to a change or an inflection point, and all of this depends obviously on how the war develops and what its result will be. Yes, of course, the embarrassment that you mentioned, I think, was very clearly seen in the different positions taken by the Gulf states. Kuwait and Qatar and Oman also had a very clear response to the ongoing violations. The position of the UAE and Bahrain, I think, we're not leaning more towards, but trying to balance between condemning Hamas and also being cautious in their approach. And there's also the Saudi position, which is currently working on normalization. Over the past 2 years, regional engagement in the region has changed in an attempt to try to settle all of the various files. We've seen the reconciliation between the Gulf states and Qatar, also the reconciliation with Turkey, and the agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Can the Gulf states build upon this policy and attempt to settle these files? Can they build a productive role in any attempt to de-escalate and to contain the crisis, especially Qatar and Oman, who have played a role in the past in mediating between Washington, D.C. and Tehran on several issues? You mean in the current war in Gaza, right? And de-escalating that? Yes. Unfortunately, this war is larger than something that could be worked on by the Gulf states themselves. This is a much broader war, and it has repercussions. We've seen the involvement of international actors like the United States and also the European support for Israel. And this is unprecedented, like Yazid has said. This was unprecedented even from other states like Japan, for example, which voted in the Security Council. It has always been with the Palestinian cause, or at least remain neutral. But there is an unprecedented level of support for Israel now. And Hamas's attack has led to Israelis being angered internally, but also anger from the international community. But the view has changed afterwards with the Israeli response and also the unequal response. And this policy of genocide that is being used by Israel, this has made governments shift their positions slightly. The Gulf states want to help support a solution. They want to be a part of the solution, but I don't think it's something that they can work on their own. I think that the country that could help do this is Qatar, among the Gulf states, for one main reason, and it is that it hosts Hamas leaders, and there is an office representing Hamas there. As is known, this office for Hamas was based on American desire and also with Israeli approval, because it helped ensure security and stability and development in Gaza to a certain extent. Qatar has been under immense pressure by other countries because of this, but now we see that this pressure has changed, and these countries that were pressuring or blaming Qatar for hosting Hamas. They're trying to benefit from Qatar's role as a supporter of the people in Gaza and benefiting from this office being there in Qatar, just like they benefited from the Taliban having representation in Qatar with the Afghani file. There are currently talks that there are reports that there are talks ongoing in Doha between Hamas and international actors to try to resolve this issue first by securing the release of the hostages and then de-escalating. I think that the Gulf states can do more than that if they all unified their position and presented a unified front. But as is known, each one of the Gulf states has their own interests, has their own analysis and calculus, but all of them agree on the importance of having security and stability in the region, and they're all in agreement that the solution needs to be based on UNSC resolutions and the two-state solution. But to what extent the Gulf states could actually support this process, each one of the states has their own perspective. Like you've mentioned yourself, Ilham, there's a very much stronger position taken by Qatar and Kuwait and Oman, to the extent where Oman has stopped allowing Israeli airlines using their airspace. Oman tried as much as possible to, through several rounds, to have an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue and to help reach a solution. But Oman's capabilities are limited if there isn't a Gulf consensus on this issue. And unfortunately, this Gulf consensus is non-existent now. Thank you very much, Abdullah. And so, based on this role for Qatar to reach de-escalation or to secure the release of hostages, with this American policy against Hamas, could Qatar rethink its relationship with the movement in the future? The relationship between Qatar and the United States is a strategic relationship for Qatar. It's a very important relationship. There is a security agreement between the two states. There's also an American base in Qatar. Qatar is a small state that is in a very tumultuous area, and so it needs to maintain this alliance with the United States. And the view of the United States and the relationship, the US's view and its relationship with Qatar is important. But Qatar, through its diplomatic efforts and through its own approach, has been able to show the U.S. administration that the relationship with the Hamas and it being there is beneficial, not just for the region and the United States, but also for Israel as well. And that it is beneficial for the Palestinian people who are under siege. If not for this relationship and if not for this door being open or this window being open to the world, then there would not have been any form of dialogue, and it would not have been possible to rebuild Gaza after the various Israeli wars on it. And it wouldn't have been possible for assistance to get to Gaza, who are living, the people of Gaza living in a large open air prison under the Israeli policies towards Gaza. I think American policy now is more understanding that this door being open is very important for it, and that at the end of the day there needs to be dialogue, and this is what happens after every crisis and after every war. And there needs to be reconstruction, there needs to be assistance, and if they pressure Qatar to close this door, then this will make it much more difficult for the United States and other international actors to hold any kind of dialogue or talks with Hamas and to deliver assistance to Gaza. And this will have a negative impact not just on the people of Gaza, but also on Israel and the region as a whole. And so I think there is an understanding. The first attack that by Qatar or against Qatar has now started to the attacks against Qatar has decreased. At what extent they will continue to decrease, I think it's difficult to say, especially if the war continues. But Qatar has proven through its policies and through it hosting the Hamas office has shown that it can contribute and assist at least in allowing for dialogue and for assistance be provided to Gaza. Thank you very much, Abdullah Ba'aboud. We'll now open the floor to questions. I apologize for the delay in taking the questions. There are some questions that have been submitted in the chat. And if you also have any additional questions, you can ask them directly to the speakers. There's a question. I think Majid could answer this. It's the question from Ali Umair, and it states that the current American administration has removed the Houthis from their classification as a terrorist group, which had been approved by the Trump administration. Does what the group did in targeting Israel and openly declaring war on it, could it change the view of the Biden administration and lead to it being classified as a terrorist group? Thank you very much, Ilham. I think that the Houthis being involved in this battle will lead to rethinking a lot about the nature of the role and the threat that they pose, especially to the international community. The repercussions of the Houthi involvement are still unclear, and it depends to what extent the Houthis will continue with their military involvement in the battle. These attacks or these messages that they tried to convey through these attacks to Israel are limited, but have led to a very clear response. We'll see now. We started to see Israeli military response, and also the redeployment of forces to the Red Sea, and we might also see a redefinition of their national security. I think the Houthis might start to be seen as an active opponent within the Israeli security, intelligence, and military establishment, and this will lead to or require a response from the international community in Washington. I think nobody wants to end the peace process in Yemen, but nobody wants there to be a risk-taking actor in the southern Red Sea that could lead to further complications. So we might see a political response. We might see escalation against the Houthis and them being classified once again as a terrorist group. There were questions 2 years ago about whether Biden ended this classification too early without getting any concessions or any commitments by the Houthis in exchange for that. But the question now is, will he deal with this mistake at the end of this term, or will this be left to the next administration, to the next term? I don't think Trump does not seem to be. I think if it was a Trump administration, for example, it would lead to classification of the Houthis, and this would completely stall the peace process in Yemen. This could be one of the potential dimensions, especially if the Houthis continue to be involved or if their involvement develops in this war. Thank you very much, Majid. Thomas?
Give you the space to answer this question from Adnan Basha. Is the Taliban's silence related to their efforts to maintain, is the Taliban silence related to their efforts to maintain the relationship with the US? I'm sorry. I'm not sure if you understood the question. It's a little bit vague. I can't hear you, Thomas. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry. Not being an expert on the Taliban, I would probably defer to one of my colleagues on the panel to try to answer that question. Sorry.
نعم هل ربما
Thank you, Thomas.
Mesa.
The question is the Taliban silence to what's happening in the region Is it related to their efforts? I think the Taliban are much further away, but I don't know. I think Taliban is much further away. They're not a part of any of the active regional axes or alliances, and so I don't see it as being related to this session. The second question is to you, Yazid. The question is from Ryan Bailey. I'm going to be asking it in English if you'll allow me.
On the Israeli ground incursion into Gaza appears to have some echoes of the siege of Beirut in 1982. Your book covered the siege in detail and how the Palestinian factions prepared for the battle. Based on your knowledge there, can you speak to any parallels you might see between now and 1982 and how Israel and Hamas might act as the ground invasion progresses?
والجواب بالعربي ماشي الحال.
ترجمة الفكرية متاحة.
Yes, you can answer in Arabic.
يعني أكيد يبدو بعدة جوانب إنه في نوع من
It seems that there are some similarities with the Israeli siege of Beirut in 1982 and what Israel is doing today in the Gaza Strip. But there are also important differences. One of the similarities is the Israeli belief, or by the belief of the current political and military leadership in Israel, having the belief that they can destroy a political movement or political force, Palestinian political force. In the past, this was the Palestinian Liberation Front, with Fatah being the primary actor, and now with the Hamas movement, which has more of an Islamist ideology, and that they could be removed from Gaza. There are some similarities, but I think there are also several differences. One being that in 1982, the world was in a completely different place. The non-aligned movement wasn't at its peak, but they had influence within the United Nations and the international community. There was cohesiveness among the non-aligned movement with the Soviet bloc, and we're also in the beginning of European and Western sympathies increasing for the Palestinian cause. We saw this in some of the meetings that were conducted between the French President Mitterrand or the Greek Prime Minister at the time, meeting with Palestinian leadership, including Yasser Arafat, also Portugal hosting Palestinian officials. And so I think the situation at the time was very different, and this led to the Israeli siege of Beirut, leading to more international solidarity, including Chinese and Soviet solidarity, as well as European solidarity, and pushing for the importance of self-determination for Palestinians. But what's happening today, for several reasons, including the shifts and the transformations at the international level that I spoke about earlier, the changes within Western societies, and also the political alliances within Western societies, and us going back to a different type of conflict at the international level. For all of these reasons and factors, the response in Europe and within the United States towards what has happened in Gaza and what happened in southern Israel on the 7th of October, and what has happened since then, rather than there being more solidarity with what is happening to the civilians in Gaza, similar to the civilians during the siege of Beirut, we see that there is now preparations to stand in support of the military operations by Israeli forces that are causing a high amount of civilian casualties without any demand even for a ceasefire. And so there has been a shift, and so the two sieges, I think, show very clearly that there is a change within Western society. But we also need to be clear that, and here I would like to say that an important critical aspect It is the right of the Palestinians and supporters of the Palestinians anywhere to also ask questions and to ask for accountability for the Palestinian leadership themselves and whether they actually took the right steps or not, whether they made the right decisions or not. And I think it is our right. And here I would like to mention something that might be a bit upsetting to some of the participants here. I would like to remind you that the siege of Beirut ended with the Israeli forces going into Western Beirut and then bringing in Lebanese right-wing militias into the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp, and the Israeli forces surrounded the camp, and these Lebanese militias carried out atrocious massacres against civilians there. And there were protests in Israel, larger than the largest protest that happened at the time happened in Israel, and they wanted Ariel Sharon, the Minister of Defense, to be held accountable. And the Israeli investigative committee found that they said that they did not know. Sharon's response was that he did not know what the militias would do, and they said the investigative committee said that the history of these militias were known, and their vicious attacks during the Lebanese civil war were known, and that he had the responsibility to know what they would do, and that they should have intervened immediately and not 2 or 3 days later. And so I want to say that today that the plan for Hamas's attack on the 7th of October should have known that there would be targeting of civilians, whether by undisciplined or uncontrollable, or whether this was purposeful. But regardless, Hamas's leadership must bear the responsibility for the killing of civilians. The number of Israeli civilians could have been killed by Israeli forces themselves while retaking taking back some of these areas. But there was also very clear killing of civilians, and some of them seemed also very purposeful by Hamas militants or individuals who came in from Gaza and were not stopped by Hamas. And so we must hold Hamas's military and political leadership responsible for their part of what they do, because there are repercussions for these actions. And just moments before the meeting, I saw an interview with the leader in Hamas who said very clearly that we will do it again, that we'll do this again and again and again. And so if we want the freedom of the Palestinians and self-determination and the right to resistance, as much as there is a right, there is also responsibility, and there is a difference between one option and another, and between one decision and another, and between the different political Palestinian groups. There are differences, there are different opinions, and we need to say this. We need to say that the situation today could have been different, and gaining solidarity and imposing a ceasefire if the approach that was chosen by Hamas on the 7th of October, whether it was purposeful or not, this contributed to facilitating the West supporting Israel in this way and allowing the killing of Palestinian civilians with this unconditional support. Thank you very much, Dr. Yazid. The next question is to Abdullah Ba'abud, and it's from Philippe Medina. He asked if Oman is playing a mediation role right now towards de-escalation, and if not, do you think it can help play this role as an important mediator in the region? Thank you very much, Ilham, and thank you, Felipe, for the question. As is known, Oman has always tried to assist in finding a solution for the Palestinian issue and trying to support dialogue between the Palestinians and Israel. So, for example, after the Oslo Accords, Oman opened an office established an office in Tel Aviv, and an Israeli office, commercial office, was established in Muscat. Oman also hosts an organization responsible for desalinating water which has shares owned by Israel. There was also visits. There were also exchanged visits, and even Netanyahu was invited by Sultan Qaboos, may he rest in peace. And so there have been dialogues, and also these were conducted also in coordination with the Palestinian leadership. And the objective of all of this was to reassure Israel that any solution for the Palestinian issue will be one that the whole region and the Arab states would not have a problem with in dealing with Israel as a country in the region. But unfortunately, with the second intifada, many things changed. The first and then the second intifada, now the war in Gaza. This will lead to significant changes, and we don't know where the Palestinian issue will lead. And what I don't think this could end the Palestinian cause, but will it take it back to being a priority? Because we must not forget that the Palestinian cause has been neglected for a long time by many actors around the world, and not just in the region. It has become a marginal issue, one that is not a priority or of concern to many. And this might justify what Hamas did. I'm not speaking here on, just like Yazid said, there's a difference. But this might be understood that this attack at this time was because the leadership of Hamas saw that the Palestinian cause is becoming more and more marginalized, and that even the Arabs were moving on from it. With regards to Oman, it has always been trying to, and has tried to, and continues to try to resolve issues through mediation. That war is not a solution, that dialogue is the best and most suitable way to resolve these crises. And so Oman will play a role. I'm not sure, honestly, I have no idea what Oman is currently doing. But based on what I see in the statements that we've seen from the Omanis, they've taken a very clear position. And this is a reflection first of Oman's position on the Palestinian issue, and also the position of Omanis, of the Omani public. The people of Oman are against what is happening, are against this war, and against the atrocities being committed in Gaza and this ongoing Nakba. And so this is leading to a lot of pressure on the Omani government. And behind all of this, I think that there's definitely communication, things that we might not hear about anytime soon, to try to resolve this crisis. I don't know if this is in coordination with the Gulf states in general, or with some Gulf states, maybe with Qatar. That could be the case, and I think that Oman will try to play any role it can in resolving this crisis, because it believes that it cannot exist in a world and in a region that is with so much tension and polarization, and that this crisis must be resolved so that everyone can focus on development and on improving the situation in the region. I think there are attempts, but I don't know any details about these Omani attempts, unfortunately. If we have more time, if you'll allow me, Ilham, I think that there is a role for more powerful international countries on this, and I think that China is playing a role. This is unconfirmed reports, but I've heard information that there's an ongoing dialogue between some of the states in the region, and whose representatives are now in China. I can't say which states, but these are regional states. These are important regional states who have a role and this ongoing conflict. And what this will lead to, it's difficult to say. I think that China might see this as an opportunity, just like China saw an opportunity in the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It might see this also as an opportunity to make further gains diplomatically. I agree with what Thomas said, that China did not play the role of China in that agreement might have been exaggerated, but it's trying to find the role now because it sees this as a part of its competition with the United States in the region, an attempt to win the hearts and minds of the public in the Arab world. And so I think that China will play a significant role. Whether Oman and other states will also play a role, I think they will play a supporting role. But I think that this mediation efforts requires a more powerful international actor. Thank you very much, Abdullah. Unfortunately, we have gone over time, but we'll take one final question to Thomas.
Does this
A question from Shirin.
mark the official comeback of Palestinian militia in Lebanon with the patronage of Hezbollah? It's a question, Thomas.
Could you repeat the question? I missed just one small part of it.
Does the Gaza war mark the official comeback of Palestinian militia in Lebanon with the patronage of Hezbollah?
The official comeback, I'm not sure that they ever left. But I would actually be interested in hearing Yazid answering this question, since he is much better than I am on the two aspects here, the Palestinian militias and the Lebanon aspect. So I would happily defer to him on that.
You're putting me on the spot. يعني ما كثير متابع أنا من هالناحية.
I'm not really following up, honestly, and so I apologize. And I also have to leave as well. And so, yeah, we're very sorry for keeping you so late. I'm sure that you have other commitments. I apologize also to the participants. We weren't able to answer all of the questions, but we will give more of an opportunity. We might send some of these questions to you and then send the responses to the participants for the questions that weren't answered. I will try to coordinate that myself with the speakers. Thank you all very much to our dear speakers. Thank you for all of the very important comments that you've brought up. You've answered some questions. Obviously, there continue to be a lot of unanswered questions that might not be answered anytime soon, and they all depend on the developments that we will see in the region in the coming period. And we hope that peace and security are brought into the region, and that we can help stop the bloodshed in the region and the Arab world. Thank you all very much. We apologize for taking too long.